a billionaire named Hannon is staying at a hotel in 1937 Los Angeles, where he writes a letter to one of his employees. In this message, he reveals that he has made a perilous discovery that will likely result in his death. Once finished, he heads to the ballroom and hands the letter to a bartender named Ashton, instructing him that a man named Douglas will retrieve it later. After returning home, Hannon goes to bed with his wife, but suddenly the entire room vanishes, and he wakes up in a laboratory in 1999. It turns out that the 1937 city and all its inhabitants exist within a virtual reality simulator designed by Hannon's company. Leaving the lab, Hannon visits his favorite bar, where he takes his medication while being watched by mysterious men. He then uses a payphone to leave a message for Douglas, but the call is cut short when an unknown individual appears at the back door. Shocked by this person's presence, Hannon follows them into a dark alley, where he prepares to share his discovery. However, before he can speak, the stranger stabs him, killing him instantly. The following morning, Douglas, Hannon's protege, listens to the messages on his answering machine before heading to his bathroom, where he is horrified to discover blood on his sink and a bloodied shirt in his trash can. One of the messages is from the police, urgently requesting him to come to the station. Without listening to the rest of the recordings, Douglas rushes over and meets Detective McBain, who shows him Hannon's dead body. Devastated, Douglas confirms the identity and answers McBain's questions, explaining that he worked for Hannon for 6 years and considered him a close friend. Together, Douglas and McBain visit Hannon's office, where the detective inquires about the company's projects. Douglas vaguely explains that they develop computer software, but insists that the details are confidential. At that moment, they notice a woman named Jane in another room. Douglas is startled when she introduces herself as Hannon's daughter. As his boss never mentioned having children, he also senses that he has seen her before. While McBain takes Jane for questioning, Douglas visits the 13th floor, where he meets a programmer named Whitney, who is mourning Hannon's death. Whitney discusses their ongoing simulation project, mentioning that Hannon frequently visited the virtual Los Angeles 1937, even though it was still incomplete. When Douglas asks if he knew about Jane, Whitney admits he was unaware of her existence. Later, Douglas sees Jane leaving in a cab, becomes suspicious, and asks the receptionist for her hotel details so he can follow her. Meanwhile, McBain interrogates Whitney about the research. Whitney explains that the virtual reality is populated with self-aware, learning individuals who are completely oblivious to the fact that they are mere computer programs. The reason for simulating 1937 Los Angeles was Hannon's desire to relive his youth. At Jane's hotel, Douglas confronts her about her last conversation with Hannon. Jane reveals that she had been living in France, but was summoned to the US a few days ago by her father, who wanted her to help shut down the company. Later, Jane meets with Hannon's lawyer to discuss his will, only to learn that Hannon made a last-minute change, transferring ownership of the company to Douglas. Simultaneously, McBain informs Douglas of this unexpected change, making him a prime suspect. When Douglas claims he never spoke to Hannon on the day of the murder, McBain points out that Hannon's calling card was used shortly before his death. Back at home, Douglas listens to the rest of his messages and finally hears Hannon mentioning a hidden letter within the simulation. Hannon begins to disclose his discovery, but is interrupted as he asks an unknown person, "How did you find me?" Determined to uncover the truth, Douglas rushes to the office and searches for Hannon's records. He then requests Whitney to connect him to the simulation. Initially, Whitney refuses, warning of the risks, but Douglas convinces him by arguing that he either committed murder and forgot, or is being framed. Whitney allows him 2 hours despite the danger. Lying inside the simulation chamber, Douglas is transported to 1937, where he finds himself inhabiting the body of a bank clerk. Disoriented, he rushes to the bathroom to compose himself. His boss notices his distress and grants him the day off. Fascinated by how real the simulation feels, Douglas takes a cab to Pasadena, where Hannon previously occupied the body of an antique store owner. Arriving at the shop, Douglas is stunned to discover that the owner, Grierson, is identical to Hannon. However, Grierson does not recognize him, but does find Douglas oddly familiar. Seeking further clues, Douglas visits the hotel and speaks to the dancers, until one of them directs him to Ashton. Douglas is shocked to see that Ashton is a mirror image of Whitney, but keeps this to himself. Ashton describes Hannon as a frequent guest who enjoys the company of young women, which surprises Douglas. When he inquires about the letter, Ashton feigns ignorance. Suddenly, Douglas starts feeling ill as his session nears its end, forcing him to rush to the bathroom. Seconds later, he wakes up in the lab, still unwell. Meanwhile, in the simulation, Ashton watches in confusion as the bank clerk, whose body Douglas had occupied, suddenly loses all memory of how he got there. Back in reality, Whitney scolds Douglas for extending his session, but his frustration turns to curiosity when Douglas describes how authentic the simulation felt. However, Whitney is disgusted upon hearing that Hannon used the program to pursue women. Their conversation is interrupted by a security guard, who informs Douglas that someone is waiting for him. In the lobby, Douglas meets Tom, who claims to have seen Hannon at the bar on the night of his death, requesting a private conversation. Douglas takes Tom to the parking lot, where Tom suddenly attacks him, accusing him of taking Hannon. Douglas fights back, smashing Tom's head into a car window. Tom calls him insane and one of America's most wanted before fleeing. Later, Douglas has dinner with Jane, discussing Hannon's final message and his memory lapses. Jane advises him to report everything to the police and avoid the simulation. She also refuses to talk about her past, but admits she feels as though she knows Douglas. They dance together, and after suggesting that déjà vu might be love at first sight, Jane kisses Douglas. That night, the police arrest Douglas as the primary suspect in Hannon's murder. At the station, McBain presents security footage of Douglas's car near the bar where Hannon was killed. The detective theorizes that Douglas murdered Hannon to stop him from shutting down the company. Additionally, Tom had informed the police that he saw Douglas leaving with Hannon. But hours earlier, Tom himself was found dead. Douglas spends the night in jail, but in the morning, Jane secures his release by providing an alibi. Determined to solve the mystery, Douglas logs into the simulation again. This time he fails to start the timer, meaning he has no time limit. Transported into the middle of a dance competition, he abruptly abandons his partner and heads to Grierson's shop, smashing a window to get his attention. Grierson admits to experiencing memory blackouts and seeing glimpses of another life. He also shows Douglas a briefcase containing an expensive suit he has no recollection of buying or wearing. Douglas realizes Hannon used this disguise when logging into the simulation. Later at the hotel, Grierson recalls that Hannon handed a letter to a man. When he points to Ashton, Ashton panics and sneaks away. Douglas chases him into the locker room, where Ashton ambushes him with a gun. Having read the letter, Ashton realized his world was fake and tested the theory by driving to the city's edge. In Tucson, he saw the simulation's boundary, confirming that everything he knew was artificial. Laughing hysterically, Ashton shoots Douglas twice. Just as he prepares to kill him, Douglas fights back. The chase leads to the swimming pool, where Ashton attempts to drown Douglas. At the last moment, Whitney pulls Douglas out of the simulation. Later, Douglas finds Jane, who confesses that their world is also a simulation within another. The real murderer is Jane's abusive husband, David, who took over Douglas's body to kill Hannon. Meanwhile, Whitney accidentally brings Ashton into the real world by dying in the simulation. Ashton, now in Whitney's body, is fascinated by his new reality. However, David takes control of Douglas's body and murders Ashton before attempting to kill. Unfortunately, McBain arrives just in time and shoots David. With David's consciousness trapped in the simulation, Douglas wakes up in David's body in the real world of 2024. Jane introduces him to her futuristic world, revealing that her father, whose likeness was used for Hannon, is still alive. Thank you for watching till the end and subscribe for more videos in the future, and make sure to check this video right here